Who was John Maynard Keynes, and how did he come to play such an important role in the economic lives of the American people? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that y'all know brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you, and as always, to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, nice to have you all back. If you're new to FFF, subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we have strived for some 20 years or more to make the finest libertarian commentary page on the internet. And subscribe to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. Subscribe to this YouTube channel, and come and support us as we advance liberty by presenting this principal case for the libertarian philosophy. You know, Richard, over the years, we've talked a lot about Austrian economics and the Austrian paradigm, some of the principal figures in Austrian economics, Menger, Mises, Hayek, and so forth. But I don't think we've ever talked about the paradigm to which Americans are still adhering to, the paradigm of Keynesianism, is manifested by John Maynard Keynes in the History of Economic Thought. So I thought, it's important that we look at this framework. I mean, it's something that we stand against as Austrian economists. We hold that it has been a major contribution to the destruction of America's economic prosperity, to to the debauchery of our currency. And but I think it's important to look at it and examine it and critically analyze it for the sake of just understanding the broader context of where we are as a country economically and where we need to go. When I was in college, I was an economics major at Virginia Military Institute, and unfortunately, I never learned anything about Austrian economics. I mean, I never even heard it mentioned. It might have been mentioned and it just went over my head, but predominantly all the economics classes were oriented toward Keynesianism. That this was the big paradigm that had captured academia. I think it still captures academia. You can give me your appraisal as an academician in a few minutes. But, after I discovered libertarianism and Austrian economics, I thought, gosh, was my whole college education wasted over studying this really destructive paradigm? And I finally decided that no, it wasn't wasted at all, because to understand economics and understand where we are today, I think it's important to understand the Keynesian paradigm, the whole Keynesian framework. And so I'm glad that I was educated in that sense. Then it was easier for me that when I discovered Austrian economics to understand why Austrian economics was so valuable and why it was so important in getting America out of the economic morass that really Keynesianism has put us into. So I'm going to turn it over to you. I don't know very many economists or economic professors that know more about the history of economic thought than you do. And so take it away, Richard. Tell us, who was John Maynard Keynes and why was his paradigm, what was the nature of his paradigm, and why was it so universally accepted and embraced?
You mean Keynes wasn't right? Oh, okay. Well, let me sort of give a thumbnail biography first. Keynes was born in 1883. He died of a heart attack in 1946. His father was a rather well-known and prominent professor of economics, or it was still then called political economy, at Cambridge University, John Neville Keynes. And he wrote a widely respected and still fairly respected book on economic methodologies, a book called The Nature and Scope of Political Economy, in which he actually gives a good deal of time to the Austrians versus the German historical school. And that was the sort of the intellectual environment that he grew up in. His his mother was a rather prominent social figure in that setting as well. He graduated from the Cambridge University with high honors in virtually all of his subjects. He studied economics there with the likes of Alfred Marshall and others who were very prominent. And his really first claim to notoriety was not even in economics. Before the First World War, he wrote a book on the theory of probability, which is still considered a classic in statistical theory for having been one of the steps in the evolution of statisticians thinking upon their subject matter and how to evaluate things. But his real international claim to fame came from a book that he published immediately in the aftermath of the First World War. And this book was called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. During the First World War, he had been working in the British Treasury Department, and he was selected to be part of the delegation that went to Paris after the armistice of November 11, 1918, that ended the fighting of the First World War, to be part of the British delegation going to the peace terms, that is, what eventually became the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in July of 1919. But Keynes actually left the conference early. He stepped away and went back and wrote this famous book, having come to the conclusion that the Allies, Britain and France in particular, but also the United States going along with a lot of it, was imposing a harsh and unjustifiable and economically unviable peace on a defeated Germany. The stripping of German territories, the seizing and the distribution of German colonies in Africa and Asia between the British and the French and the Japanese. And then the imposition of extremely, what were viewed as harsh reparation payments. That is, sums of money that Germany, post-war Germany, would have to pay to the Allied powers to compensate for the costs and the destruction that they were saying was all Germany's fault in starting the war. And that if Germany had continued making these payments to the letter under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany would have been paying reparations up till 1967. The Germans said that this was unpayable. Critics said that it was manageable, even in the post-war reality of Germany. But whether the economics of the reparations being harsh or not, in some ultimate financial viability sense, the fact is that the Germans viewed it that way, and they viewed Keynes as sort of a hero to them. Here, they're the defeated nation, the pariah in the eyes of the victorious nations, and here is a respected British economist coming out with a book and basically saying, regardless of Germany's responsibility for having caused the war, these were peace terms that was going to be not only impossible in his view for Germany to meet in terms of the financial requirements, and would create such anger, resentment, bitterness among the German people that we should not be surprised if a moment arrives where they will attempt to free themselves from the shackles of the Treaty of Versailles and counteract in revenge to reverse all of the consequences of them. This book was widely read almost immediately, translated into many languages. That was the entree to Keynes's international stature and fame. Germans and Austrians at the time viewed him as the great spokesman for the defeated peoples of Central Europe. And of course, by the 1930s, with the rise of Hitler and Hitler's insistence that what he wanted to do was to use a phrase to make Germany great again, and that he would overthrow the shackles of the Treaty of Versailles, that he would build up Germany's military strength and reestablish its territorial claims of unifying the German people. So that, let's say, 15 years after the book came out and its initial popularity, he was seen to be sort of like a prophet of what was happening in Central Europe. So that was his first claim to fame. He wrote on that, and he wrote a variety of books after that on monetary policy, monetary theory, the most important one of which was a 2-volume treatise that appeared in 1930 called A Treatise on Money. If you read Keynes's biographies and the diaries that they quote in these biographies, diary passages that they quote in these biographies, Keynes believed that this book would establish him as the leading living monetary theorist in the world. The only problem with it, Jacob, is that in the immediate aftermath, the first year or two after the treatise on money appeared, many of the famous and notable and respected economists of that time reviewed the book, and virtually all of them panned it. Logical inconsistency, factual errors, omissions, inconsistencies, and then finally a coup de grace. A young economist from faraway Vienna penned a lengthy 2-part review essay that appeared in the British journal Economica, which was published by the London School of Economics, basically demolishing it. And who was this young upstart economist from Vienna? Friedrich A. Hayek. And he basically said that Keynes did not even seem to understand the nature and the role of an interest rate, that his aggregates were hiding all the real microeconomic relationships that determine the workings of the coordination and the discontinuities that may arise in the market economy. And that he seemed to have no understanding of a theory of capital. Well, Keynes was very upset about this, particularly Hayek's reviews. But Keynes basically went back to Cambridge, metaphorically, to lick his wounds, and spent the next 5 years rewriting a new book. And that book is what became the Bible, as some advocates and supporters of Keynes initially called it, the Bible of a new economics, and that being the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which was published in February 1936. Now, the interesting irony also, in given that it became so the basis of modern macroeconomics, is that if you go through the reviews or essays that were written after the book came out, evaluating and criticizing the book, there's no one critic who writes anything like Hayek had done with the treatise on money, because Hayek never reviewed the general theory himself. But if you read Economist X, well, this is a fundamental flaw in Keynes's general theory. You read Economist Y, this is a fundamental different flaw in the general theory. Economist Z, well, this is a major problem with another aspect of Keynes's argument in the general theory. And so while no one critic sort of put it all together as to what were the fundamental problems, if you take this economist's criticisms and critique, and this economist's criticism and critique, and this economist's criticism and critique, and put them together, these analyses were as devastating and challenging the fundamentals, the logic, the reasoning, the policy implications of the general theory as had happened with the treatise on money. But in spite of this, within a few years, certainly during the 1940s, both during the war years and in its immediate aftermath of the late 1940s, the Keynesian set of ideas in the general theory captures virtually the entire economics profession. The textbooks that started appearing in the post-war period, which would now educate an entire generation of people coming back from the war, young people who had been too young to go off to war, and now in the immediate post-war period were the children of parents who had gone to war, going to college themselves. This was now the new economics that they learned. It is an interesting sociological phenomenon, in my view, that a book that was heavily criticized from a variety of directions that otherwise would have resulted in the second book disappearing into the dustbin of history the way the earlier book had been, ended up becoming this essential basis of an entire field of economics. Paul Samuelson, who wrote the most widely used economics textbook in the United States for a good quarter of a century after the Second World War, a textbook just called Economics. It was the one that I was assigned as undergraduate, the 7th edition that came out in 1967. After Keynes died in 1946, there was a volume put together of essays by his admirers, and Paul Samuelson is one of them, and he refers to the general theory as the Bible of economics. This idea is the core text that now is the revelation that transcends and changes everything, and to dominate the profession. And it is not an exaggeration that during the 1950s and into the 1960s, if you were to challenge the premises, the rationale, the presumptions of the general theory from either a theoretical or a policy point of view, that was like a kiss of death for you as an economist. You don't understand. You don't have the mental capacity. You've been influenced by that older generation of economists from before the war who are totally out of step with the new economics and its vision to be able to have government solve the problems of society through monetary and fiscal policy. So when I was an undergraduate, that's like yourself, when I was an undergraduate, and I was assigned a macroeconomics book, that book was synonymous with just Keynesianism. There were no alternative points of views or critiques presented. Macroeconomics was Keynesian economics. That only began to change in the late 1960s and then into the 1970s with the rise in growing significance of Friedman's monetarism, the emergence of supply-side economics, the arrival of what was called new classical or rational expectations economics, and then following 1974 with Friedrich Hayek receiving the Nobel Prize in Economics, a revival of interest in economics in general, and particularly his critique of Keynesianism and macroeconomics as a whole. So it's a strange sociological phenomenon. And his approach still haunts the profession today, which gets me to sort of emphasizing what does he assume in his model, if you will, and its problems. First of all, he says that we have to reject all of what we call microeconomics if we want to understand the economy as a whole. The idea that one starts with the choices and decisions of individuals, that one looks at the processes of marginal decision-making under conditions of scarcity, that one focuses on the workings of and the coordination in markets and across markets on the basis of the structures of relative prices and the relationships and patterns of a whole array of separate and individual supplies and demands in the various distinctive related markets of the economy, and that it is prices and wages and their adaptations and adjustments that ensure product and goods coordination and full employment for labor. This is all wrong, he says. There is a separate economics to study output as a whole, employment as a whole, the movement of prices as a whole. And this becomes his notion of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We assume, we sum over and submerge under these notions of an aggregate demand of output as a whole, aggregate supply of production as a whole. And we just see that there can be periods when then the amount of total demand in the economy for everything is less than the potential total supply that could be offered on the market at full employment. There is a gap. There's the potential and the reality of more being produced and more people being employed than the market will absorb it through the private sector demands for consumer goods, the private sector businessman's investment decision. And nothing can restore the economy in any reasonable amount of time without great cataclysm and difficulty of adjustment, other than the government to fill the gap and the total spending that would establish a return to full employment being introduced by the government as a supplement and an addition to whatever the private sector demand for output and employment might be. And that became the basis for Keynes's approach. Now, you might ask the question, but why can't markets just adjust? And he sets up a whole series of theoretical stumbling blocks that by assuming them, by necessity, makes it difficult to imagine a market adjusting. You might say, well, if market conditions change and there's a falling off of demand for certain products, and therefore the demand for hiring particular workers. Like with every change in supply and demand, couldn't workers lower their wage demands given the decreased demand for their services in particular employments to bring the supply and demand back into balance? Just like if a business finds itself with unsold inventory, how do you attract more customers? Well, other things held given, you lower the price, you put things on sale to attract an increase in the demand for what you want to clear off the market. Why couldn't workers do this? No, workers suffer from money illusion, Keynes says. Workers are more concerned with the dollar nominal amount of income they earn than the real value of their real wages. And therefore, even if a cut in money wages would not reduce their real wages, because prices in general might be going down as well, and therefore the amount of money you're earning would still buy the same real amount of goods in the market. No, workers only care about their nominal wages. So even if prices fell by 5% and workers could take a 5% cut in wages and in real buying terms be no worse off, no, they only care about the dollar amount in their paycheck. So wages can't bring full employment again. Then Keynes talks about, well, the businessmen are irrational individuals who are guided by animal spirits. It's like a game of musical chairs in the business world, particularly in the investment sector. The future is uncertain, and that very uncertain makes investment business decisions irrational. What do I mean by this? Hey, Bob, Joe said that he heard from you that the investment climate isn't looking good, and that maybe we could cut back on our investment plans. And well, where did you hear that, Bob? Well, I heard it from Sam. And well, where did Sam hear from it? Well, he heard it from John. And where did John hear it from? Well, he heard it from Bob. And where did Bob hear from? Bob said he heard it from you, William. I mean, it's sort of like everybody's just, what do you think? What do you think? Oh, no, the market's going to go down. I better cut back my investments. And therefore, no investment demand, no employment demand for workers in the investment sectors. Workers get unemployed. They won't take wage cuts. Unemployment rises. And then sometimes there'll be a change in animal spirits. And suddenly, yeah, markets look good. Yeah, markets look good. And therefore, yeah, we'll produce more. We'll hire more workers. But then the pattern starts again. There's an irrationality in the businessman and in his investment decision making because of uncertainty. But government is rational. Government is long-term and far-seeing. They're not influenced by the emotional erraticness of changing daily circumstances. Government and those in government take the long view. Oh, if there's these temporary gaps between what the economy could produce and what it is producing, government through deficit spending and increasing demand can bring workers back to full employment. And if an inflation is threatened, don't worry, Jacob, don't worry. Then the government can run a budget surplus and bring down heated demand in the economy. In fact, Jacob, that's why governments don't have to balance their budget on an annual basis. They can run deficits in the recession and depression years, and they can run surplus in the good, high demand inflationary years, and they'll balance, the budget will be balanced over the business cycle. And then that gets to the realpolitik of this, which has been emphasized by some members of particularly the public choice schools, such as James M. Buchanan and Richard Wagner, especially in a wonderful book they wrote called Democracy in Deficit, that originally came out in 1977, but it's an oldie but a goodie. Which they say is that before Keynes, the rule was balanced budgets by governments, particularly in countries like Great Britain and the United States. The idea was it gave honesty and transparency. The government couldn't spend anything without explaining pretty much where the money was going to come from. And therefore, the voters and the taxpayers could know with a greater degree of openness and clarity what a government program or activity was going to cost, because it had to be stated how much would have to be collected in taxes and upon whom the taxes would fall. So therefore, like going down the aisle in the supermarket, well, if I pick an extra can of corn, I know that's going to cost me something, So there'll be less in my food budget to buy some peas. You can weigh the costs and the benefits. Here's what the government says, what the politicians say they want to do. Is it worth the cost of less money in my pocket as a private citizen, because the taxes would have to go up to cover it? But Keynes comes along. We don't need to do this. Don't worry, we don't want to balance the budget. We need deficits during bad years. But when do the good years come? If you look at the, what now, 70 odd years since the end of the Second World War, 1945 to today, out of all those years, the government has run minor surpluses in maybe 5 or 6 of them. All the other years since 1945 have been federal budget deficit years. Sometimes the deficit larger, sometimes smaller, but deficit years. It's a little amount of an exaggeration to say that except for 6 or 7 years since 1945, the U.S. has been in a recession and a depression, needing government boosting in the economy. But what Buchanan and Wagner argued is that once the budget balanced budget rule was broken, now it was open to politicians to rationalize. You know something? I can give you something and not have to tax you today. I can borrow that money and give you the goodies. So that increasingly politics became a competition among those running for public office on the illusion of something for nothing. Elect me and I'll do this. Elect me and I'll do that. Elect me and I'll do something else. And I'll either give it to you for free because I'm just going to borrow the money, and that'll be taken care of because the economy can always use a little goosing up. And well, we'll worry about raising the taxes in the future when someone else will be in office, and it's difficult to determine whether you as a taxpayer will be alive way back in that future, or if you are alive, what percentage of that future tax burden will be yours? So we have, by breaking the institutional rule of a balanced budget, Keynes opened the floodgates to unending budget deficits, massive accumulation of national debt, and the politics of illusionary benefits without cost, which I think has cumulatively created the fiscal crisis that we and many other countries around the world are facing and will see even worse of into the future. Now, Keynes's monopoly over the profession didn't stay that way. Friedman argued a reversion of the quantity theory of money against Keynes's arguments. The supply side economists argued that output and employment comes through production, not through the illusion of spending. If you lower marginal tax rates, you create incentives for people to work, save, and invest more, and greater output comes from the capacity of people to produce more and the private sector real incentives to do so. And then, of course, the revival of the Austrian school, with its emphasis that monetary increases and manipulations of interest rates inevitably and inescapably set the imbalances and distortions in the investment and related markets that set the stage for an inescapable and eventual economic downturn of what we call the recession, the depression, of the business cycle. So Keynes still doesn't have the monopoly of Keynesianism, doesn't have the monopoly of policy and theory that it once had. But unfortunately today, look at the situation. Oh, there's some unemployment. Oh, there's some output problem. What is the immediate answer? Not allow markets to be freed and further deregulated and allow the adaptation of the market itself through price adjustments and flexibility of resource use. No, immediately government has to spend, government has to borrow, government has to initiate programs to stimulate different sectors of the economy. So in that wider framework of how you even think about the role of government in society, the ghost of Keynes continues to haunt us.
All right, well, that's a very nice synopsis of a man who's played such an important, albeit negative, role in American life. And we're almost out of time, but let me just ask you one question that, and you've alluded to this, but if you could just clarify that, as you know, we have this giant revolution in the 1930s over toward a welfare state, a gigantic transformation in American life, where the role of government now becomes to take money from people in order to give it to other people. And that becomes the driving force. Then later on in the 40s, the federal government is converted to a national security state where you have massive amount of permanent military spending, permanent wartime spending that goes on continuously all the way through today. And it's often said that Keynes was the enabler of all this. Can you give us a short explanation as to why people say that he came along at the right time when these transformations were taking place?
Yeah, the short version is that in the 1920s and the 1930s, trade unions, especially in the England of his own country, began to gain great power and influence. And it became more and more difficult to, without running the risk of strikes and effects on production by strikes, to try to pressure unions to be more accommodative in wage adjustments in the changing environments of the market. So the conclusion was, certainly in the Britain of Keynes's time, and then in the 1930s with the Great Depression and the strengthening of unions in the United States, that it is politically impossible and it is ethically unpalatable to fight the unions. A, they have too much power, political clout, and B, but they're working for a fair wage for the little guy. So what do we do if you cannot jolt unions into wage adjustment to restore full employment? You get around their rigid demand of wages here by stimulating the economy through deficit spending to push demand and prices up to there. And therefore, the inflation that this generates through government money creation and funding the deficits creates this artificial profit margin of higher prices relative to the union influencing general wage level to have a wider profits to stimulate people. The other element of this, which you're alluding to, is the fact that in the decades just before, and certainly in the decades right after the First World War, there was an accelerating notion that the duties and responsibilities of the government are not merely the protection of life, liberty, and honestly acquired property from both domestic and foreign aggressions. It is there to act as a facilitator of social safety nets to assure a fair and just minimal standard of living and equity of incomes among the population. And but to redistribute wealth openly and clearly, dollar for dollar, then you're saying for every dollar that we're going to spend on those who we deem in deserving because they're in the lower income level, means that we have to take dollar for dollar from those who are, we're defining as the unjustifiable higher income categories. But Keynes's presumption of budget deficits facilitated this. Now you can be redistributing wealth not with immediate and direct tax dollars, but with borrowed dollars. And as long as you keep up with the government taxes enough to keep up with the interest payment on the accumulating deficit-based debt, then you don't have to be telling people how much the growth of the welfare state is really costing. This became strongest, Jacob, and I'm dating both of us, our remembrances of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. What was it argued? That was he thought it was workable, and critics were challenging it. The idea that with the Vietnam War, yet with the legislation starting to build the Great Society programs, which were built on Roosevelt's New Deal, we could have both guns and butter, right? Defense spending and a growing welfare state. Because what we can't tax, we can just borrow and add to a debt that we'll figure out how to fund and handle looking down in future decades. So Keynes's deficit spending philosophy facilitated that greatly.
Yeah, and I think we ought to also add the massive monetary debauchery that has been taking place over the decades. The value of the dollar just over this entire period of time has just plummeted. And so it's kind of amusing when I see people talking about, oh, well, that prices are rising today because of Ukraine or supply problems and so forth. I mean, it's so ridiculous. Some of them don't even mention the Federal Reserve in terms of the debauchery of the money supply. But if you put it in terms of the context, the overall context of the Keynesian paradigm, I mean, they've really destroyed America's monetary system, which used to be the finest monetary system in history, one based on gold coins and silver coins. And of course, as Austrians, we would call for a free market monetary system, but still, I think that's an important factor in all this, that not only the massive military spending military and welfare state spending that was unleashed with Keynesianism, not just the massive debt borrowing, but also the monetary debauchery. So on
yes,
that,
in fact, at the end of the day, the only way that this has been viable, by viable I mean on a pragmatic basis for the government to keep it going, was the fact that over the decades, a large part of whatever the government has borrowed has not siphoned wealth off from the private sector, what economists call the crowding out effect. Because if the government borrows more in the loan markets, obviously there's less real savings available for private sector borrowers to borrow. It's the fact that the government has, in the lingo of the economist, the Federal Reserve, has, in the lingo of the economist, monetized the debt. It buys up government securities issued by the Treasury and adds it to its own portfolio and pays for it by just creating money that then is injected into the banking system and then is indirectly funding all the government borrowing and starting to generate all the inflationary debasing effects.
Okay, on that note, we'll wrap things up. I want to remind everybody of my new book, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story. I did a 2-hour interview on a show last night called The Ocelli Effect. That's now posted on our website. And so I would invite you to listen to that. It has some spoilers in it, so if you want to read the book first, which I'd recommend, that's great. But if you want to get a sense of what the book's all about, you can listen to that 2-hour podcast. And Richard, I greatly enjoyed the show as always, and look forward. Thank you for your great, insightful synopsis of Lord Maynard Keynes and the role that he's played in American life. And I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.